The mental health of children is deteriorating, and that is related to their use of these screens, and it's making them more socially isolated. And it's not just the mental health, which is no small thing, it's the whole body impact. So it's been linked to obesity, issues with eyesight, myopia, short-sightedness, record number of children wearing glasses. It just is starting to physically affect their whole being.
Coming up on British Thought Leaders, Dr. Rebecca Foljambe says Britain's children are being harmed by too much screen time.
Got to the point now where we've got 25% of our 3 to 4-year-olds in this country are in possession of their own smartphone.
Dr. Foljambe says device use is a cause of growing mental health problems.
We're cultivating ADHD, and there's evidence for this. Diagnoses of ADHD are going up, that excessive use of devices can create ADHD traits and functional tic disorders, and it disrupts with the electricity and the wiring of their brains.
And that hundreds of thousands of British kids have been exposed to online abuse.
It's a huge worry, and I personally don't think we can solve this problem without admitting that the online world is a huge part of this. And we're kidding ourselves if we think we can just educate and prevent our way out of it. We have to get them away from it.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders, I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Dr. Rebecca Foljambe, GP and founder of Help Professionals for Safer Screens. Rebecca, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Children enjoy their time on screens, they can learn things, keeps them out of their parents' hair. But you've founded this organisation of health professionals who are warning about the impacts of the screens on children. I mean, what was it that made you feel the need to start the organisation?
I think it was a cumulative process really, Lee, over the past 5 to 10 years. I've got 3 teenagers myself, and we're by all means not a tech-free household. But what I was beginning to see at work, at home, when I'm out and about, is the time thievery of these things, that they're just kind of omnipresent in a child's day, and sadly at night too. They're losing a lot of sleep to them. And then we've started to really realise, especially since COVID, but it was a huge problem before, that the mental health of children is deteriorating, and that is related to their use of these screens, and it's making them more socially isolated. And it's not just the mental health, which is no small thing, it's the whole body impact. So it's been linked to obesity, issues with eyesight, myopia, short-sightedness, record number of children wearing glasses. It just is starting to physically affect their whole being, and it got to the point where I just couldn't watch it anymore. And I just felt that as health professionals we've been too quiet, and I didn't really know what we were waiting for to come forward and say, well, we might not feel we've got to a tipping point of clinical evidence that we're used to feeling as clinicians or used to waiting for before we act, but we know full well that these impacts are everywhere, and I just really wanted to bring other health professionals in to see who was interested, and as it happens, a lot are.
The starting point is, what are the official guidelines for young people's screen time, and are people following them?
Oh, crumbs. Well, we've had big organisations like UNESCO, World Health Organization, the American Journal of Pediatrics puts out a lot of stuff surrounding guidance as to how many hours the children should be using these devices. But we know that children are on them for 4, 5, 6, sometimes 7 hours a day. And this guidance is very difficult to follow because of the nature of these devices. So most of them that are in mainstream use are addictive by design. So no matter how much guidance we have around just a visceral feeling that they shouldn't be on them too much, it's very hard to follow that or create that in your home because they're so addictive. So youngsters 0 to 2 shouldn't really be on any of these screens at all. Over that, it shouldn't be more than an hour or so tops. You know, and I just think that it's got to the point now where we've got 25% of our 3 to 4-year-olds in this country are in possession of their own smartphone.
Really?
Yeah, and about a quarter of our 3 to 4-year-olds have their own social media accounts. So the guidance does look quite stringent, but it is actually sensible if you ask me. However, it's not being followed, it's not nearly being followed, because of the nature of the use and the quantity of children who are from them from a very young age. And we know that the younger a child is when they have access to a smartphone, the more likely they are to become addicted and have more unhealthy use of those devices later on as they become teens and adults.
I was hoping you could take us a bit deeper into the health impacts on children of these screens. I thought it was a mental health thing, but you're saying it's physical as well.
Oh, I think it's almost certainly physical. I mean, you can just tell when you look at a child, they've got that kind of mobile phone neck and stoop. There's constant kind of visual stress, vision stress of these bright lights on these devices and these attractive, colourful designs that are just pulling their attention from everything else. So yes, it's their mental health, but it's more into that, it's more their well-being, what they could or should be doing instead. So outside messing about or hanging out with their friends or playing sport, playing instruments, they're not doing that as much. I mean, all the evidence is telling us that they're not doing that as much. And there's increasing evidence now around links with their physical health as well as their mental health, in the way that we have more children who are obese, which is a real concern, and children who are eating whilst looking at these screens are more likely to eat less healthy food and more of it. So it seems to me every time we put a smartphone in any part of that child's life, that area or dimension of their life is immediately worse off because it's such an intrusion. And I think when we look at it in the general practice sense, I can't remember the last time I kind of consulted a child, or an adult for that matter, when a smartphone wasn't in the room. And I do feel that they're so physically attached to them. It's such like an intimate part of their being, and it's too readily available for them to be looking at and consulting all the time. They feel a bit trapped, I think, and reports are starting to say that as well. So you can't necessarily measure that. It's more a kind of adjutant in their well-being for a lot of children who probably would rather put it down. Lots of them are feeling that they are really physically and behaviourally addicted to these devices.
We've got 1 in 5 British children are struggling with speaking and understanding words. And this is record levels now. What role do you think screens play in this speech and language development problem?
A huge role. We've got a very experienced speech and language therapist in our group. In fact, the sheer diversity of the professionals we have in our group tells you in itself that this is a whole child body problem, the impacts. But the child talk, the child-parent talk is greatly impacted, possibly because you'd have a parent that's not interacting because they're on the device themselves, or the child is on their device and not interacting. We've just talked about the number of 3 to 4-year-olds that have a smartphone. I think there's a lot of background devices on in nurseries and homes. It just seems to be this constant background intrusion of these devices, and it really interrupts with their natural communication between the child and the parent. And the consultant paediatricians in our group are talking about children who are coming into clinic non-verbal as toddlers, not even babbling, not making those normal speech sounds that they normally would. And that's been evidence now as being associated with the increasing screen use, just basically stops them learning to communicate and produce sounds. And I've been pretty horrified to see pushchairs now being sold with iPhone and iPad holders. And we quite often see that at work, that children arrive fixed onto a screen from a very young age, and having to prise it out of their hands just to examine them. And it really is quite astonishing how insidiously it's crept into the image of a child. We seem to see a child now, and somewhere around them there will be a device somewhere, which is worrying.
Do you think British people are starting to wake up to this idea that maybe these screens aren't that good for their children?
Oh, I hope so, Lee. I really do. I mean, as Jonathan Haidt says, it's a collective action, and we all feel enormous pressure at some point. I know the ages that parents decide to give their child a device varies, but that pressure comes on at some point. And I think people are starting to realise, and it needs to become less socially acceptable to just give a child a phone automatically as a rite of passage from one stage in school to the other, or one peer group to another, because that might not be right for that child at that time. And it's about giving parents back the power and the confidence to say, actually, you know, my child might be the same age as all of yours, but he or she's just not ready. And I think that confidence is increasing. But as health professionals, it's nowhere near out there the way it needs to be. You know, we need to be asking and informing parents about this at antenatally, as soon as the baby's born, telling them about the impacts of screen use on their speech and language development, their communication, their sleep, their eyesight. This all needs to be brought into the main picture of what constitutes a healthy child. And I feel personally like we're slipping behind a bit on that conversation in the UK, which is you know, one of the many reasons that I founded the Health Professionals Group.
What would you say to someone who said you're being anti-libertarian, you're taking away children's rights to have their devices?
I would say, well, I mean, that's fine if that's their opinion. I think the child rights debate is less convincing for teens, if I'm really honest. I think it's extraordinarily compelling and thought-provoking when you think about babies' rights, you know, and you've got parents or carers on TikTok performing to the camera whilst a child's precariously on a bumbo on the edge of the counter. They could fall off, and that child's already online and they have this digital identity without their consent. And every time I see those sorts of films, it really makes me feel for that child. And I think that element of child's digital rights is really alarming and eye-opening, and we should all be really aware of that. Looking at it more when they're older, I'm afraid it gets a lot weaker for me. I mean, we know that in the past 10 years, child sexual abuse and exploitation has gone up by 400%. And there's been a huge surge in the past 18 months as well. And 14% of our under 16s have experienced at least one form of image-based sexual abuse online. That's 400,000 children. And most of those image-based sexual abuse perpetrators are children themselves. So I don't think it's anti-libertarian to be preventing our children from making these catastrophic and life-blighting mistakes on these devices. We have made a terrible error of allowing them to be too free on these devices. They're increasing child criminalisation, it's destroying their self-esteem, and our justice system isn't set up for it. We're behind at every step. So I don't think any child really under the age of 16 is ready for an internet-enabled smartphone, and we should be moving towards child-safe devices.
What about young people themselves? Have you heard of any feedback from them to this idea of limiting their screen time?
I have. I've watched it in my own house. They kind of battle with themselves as they become older teens, saying, oh, maybe I shouldn't be on it this long. And I resent that they have that to deal with. You know, we didn't have to deal with that part of our path to success and getting on with our own life was moderating our screen time. It seems a burden for them. I've heard both sides. I know that they enjoy it and it can socially connect them, but you don't have to have all these social media apps to do that. You know, you could have devices where they call, they message, it could have GPS, they've got their travel apps, you even have access to Childline, that sort of thing, if needed. They don't need to have these miniature computers all the time. I appreciate the benefits. The internet's incredible. I mean, I have a smartphone, for goodness sake, but I had it, luckily, at an age when I was good and ready, because that's when they came out, and I was old enough to deal with it. But they're just not ready to deal with the consequences of the mistakes. And I think what's so awful is that the most vulnerable children are affected the most, and that in itself should be a real wake-up call for us, because we're impacting the most on the most vulnerable children. And that argument which I've heard a bit, and I've done a bit of media, and people will say, well, what about the children in marginalised groups, or you know, struggling with their own identity? Well, absolutely, we shouldn't be isolating them from their peer groups, but we know all reports, all evidence points to the fact that they are the ones who are more likely to be exploited online, more likely to be possibly pressured into sharing sexual images. They're more vulnerable. So I don't see that we're really helping them at a young age, giving them access, liberal access to social media either.
If a child is sitting indoors on a screen as opposed to being outside playing with other children, going on a bike ride,
Yeah.
what things are lost? What development happens when they're kind of out there playing with other children, going on adventures?
So much is lost, and I really feel we don't need any evidence of that other than looking back on our own childhoods where most of us got to do that. I think how we've got away with just normalising these screen uses, COVID didn't help because it became their education. But also we just have forgotten that children have to be able to fall over, play, trip up, be bored, make games, experiment in friendships, all these things that they can't do on a screen. So I don't feel sad seeing a child on a screen full stop. If they've been outside playing all day and had a great time and they just, want to watch a bit of a film or something, great. But this extensive use, this thieving of their time is massively impacting on their development. And we're seeing that because they're reporting more social isolation, more loneliness. It's not conducive with a normal, healthy childhood.
It's called safetyism, is it? This idea that you go out and play and maybe you fall over and you learn how to deal with these things.
It is. We've become a bit neurotic, haven't we? The ironies are everywhere. The fact that the most deprived children are on these screens for the longest period of time and are more likely to be unsupervised is meaning that they're actually much more unsafe on their screens indoors than they ever would be outdoors. And I think society has maybe felt that they're all safe and tucked up at home, but actually they're not. They're cut off from the outdoor world where they should be, or the world off the screens where they should be for the majority of the time. In my mind, they're as unsafe now as they've ever been, because it's not normal for children around the age of 10 to have been exposed to violent porn or watched a beheading. That's horribly unsafe. I mean, I hadn't seen a beheading at the age of 12, and that would just be normalised now. You're seeing it in the reports all the time, that these horrific violent acts they're witnessing or sexual acts they're witnessing inside, safe on their screens, are making them as unsafe as they've ever been.
Do you think a majority of us adults don't quite realise how bad the things are that are on the internet that the children can see?
Totally, Lee, and I think that's the problem. Because were we given a smartphone now, we wouldn't be, a normal, happy, healthy person with no criminal intent would not be searching up violent porn or beheadings or how to start a riot or racially abuse or discriminate someone. Because that's what normal, healthy, happy, balanced, educated people would never dream of doing. Therefore, we associate the device possibly with, watching a funny TikTok video or choosing some clothes or answering our work emails. It's hard for adults to imagine, I think, and put themselves back in a teenage brain of thrill-seeking and being inquisitive and maybe wanting to shock a bit or go behind doors where they'd never normally be allowed. That's what teenagers do. But the problem is that door to the underworld of the internet is so vile and awful. And I don't think we do fully get it unless we're reading the reports, unless we're tapping into it. And a lot of parents, I think, by no fault of their own, haven't got the first idea what their children are doing online. And that's a worry, because the moment we have no idea what we're doing, then we are not able to protect them. And we're fooling ourselves if we think that we can.
A quarter of countries in the world now have some form of school smartphone ban. And other European countries are also thinking about planning this.
Yeah.
And what's happening in UK schools?
Not enough. I mean, the last time I checked, only 11% of our schools had an outright ban. I think that's now increasing, because there is a growing parent collective and various campaign groups that are really pushing now to realise the harm of these phones. We've hung around long enough. It is without doubt affecting their education when it's in their hand, in their bags, they're able to go for it in break time. All they are thinking about, most of them, is, I'm going to get back to my phone. I've got to get back to that Snap. I've got to get back to that WhatsApp. And it's not good for them. They are not concentrating on their work. I know for a fact there are many children in classrooms, because the children have told me themselves, they're answering snaps and watching Netflix in lessons. And the teachers, I can't imagine how difficult it is for the teachers. And I just think it's something that they don't meaningfully need in the school environment. Now I know, and I appreciate all the debates around it, that people have said, well, it's not going to work in schools because they'll just come home to all those risks. They might even come home and go on their device more as a kind of relapse because they've been withdrawn all day. But I don't see it like that myself. I feel that over the past 10 years or so, it's been harder for us at home because the schools have been more relaxed about these devices than we've been in our own homes. So there's been a reversal, which has been quite damaging to family dynamics. And I think schools as a rule should be setting a societal example. They're raising the bar. They're saying, in order for your child to learn well and better, they can have their smartphone out of school, please. And it's really nice when teachers and schools are brave about that, because I don't see there's any negatives in regards to the educational attainment. And already schools that have banned these devices, reading the reports of their success. I just read one about a school in Norway. It's profoundly successful. And not just educational attainment, the fact that they're talking in the playground and hanging out again. I mean, those are all measures of children learning like children should and interacting like children should.
What legislative changes would your organisation like to see?
Regulations. I don't like the word ban. I think that's it's been hugely sexy for headlines. It's been very divisive between a group of organisations that fundamentally want the same thing. But the ban has really helped pit us against each other. I think regulating these devices needs to happen fast, and for the government to be putting themselves out there and saying that internet-enabled smartphones are just not safe for children under 16. Now, I know that people are saying, well, what about the Online Safety Act? Well, the Online Safety Act doesn't say anything about the addictive nature of these devices. There's a huge part of the Online Safety Act which is missing. And also, Ofcom write these wonderful reports. I've read most of them. They're brilliant. And then they don't do anything. And that's not acceptable. And we'll go to meetings where they say, well, we just need to wait for the Online Safety Act to do its job. And it's all about education and prevention. That's not worked. And these cases, these appalling cases of children self-harming, being sextorted, killing themselves, being victims of all this sexual abuse and all this violence against women and girls. It's so much more insidious, the harm for women and girls, which is another topic, which we might come on to. That's increasing year on year. So whatever we think we're doing at the moment, we are epically failing. So we need the government in this wait to make some real changes. And in this past 10 months, where I really feel momentum has come up, and it's becoming a really important topic of conversation, the big tech companies have done precisely nothing. They've actually made things worse. So they've lowered the WhatsApp age to 13. That was a catastrophically irresponsible thing to do. And then brought in end-to-end encryption, which the National Crime Agency said that they will now miss over 90% of child sexual exploitation committed on those platforms. And it won't protect the users at all, which is what the tech companies are saying. It's actually going to stop the tech companies seeing the crime that's being committed on their own platforms. So it's every article you read is immensely frustrating. And we can't just wait for the Online Safety Act to do its job, because what about all the harms that are happening to the children now?
I wanted to ask you about the tech companies. They're obviously the ones making the screens, making the apps. You know, are they totally against what your organisation stands for, or is there some support?
They have got to live up to their responsibilities. And you watch tribunals with Zuckerberg and various criminal cases that are coming to court in America, and the harms, the grieving parents that have stood in front of these big tech leaders, of which there's just a handful, and look at the havoc that they have just created. and there seems to still be a wall. There'll be hollow apologies and just a wall of silence, or a spokesperson will come out and say, we take the safety of our users very seriously. It's wearing very thin because the proof is in the statistics and they are doing nothing. And until we can actually see the impact of what they're doing, it's not working. And we've got a problem that's too big to even handle now. They have got to admit their responsibilities. And from where I'm sitting, and I'm sure there's lots of information I'm not party to, I haven't seen them do anything meaningful at all.
What about cultural changes to support parents to kind of do the right thing?
Well, we've got to support parents. There's a lot of parental blame. There is a really important element of being very realistic about the extent of parental screen use, and inappropriate role modelling of screen use does have an impact on children. And there's evidence of that now, that the hours and type of parental screen use does impact on children. So being aware of that as parents and trying not to be on our phones too much is really important. And I think parents have an enormous investment in wanting their children to have wonderful, happy lives. Most parents want that. And I think a lot of parents, and this is going to be a big part of our health campaign we're going to roll out with health professionals for safer screens, they don't know the harms. Even when I've been on this journey and created this group of professionals who are all doing amazing work, I didn't really even have an idea of the extent of the harms then. And I think most parents don't. And they certainly aren't realising the wider impacts on sleep, health, well-being, all of those, to the extent that I think they'd want to. And I feel that we've let them down. We should have been communicating this much better than we have. So I think we need to be much more vocal about the possible harms of these devices and let parents make informed decisions. There's a lot of talk about product desires. So what would you like your child's device to look like? Well, we're asking parents that, and I think it's a bit cruel, because what we should be saying first is this is the reality of the risks and the benefits of these devices. Now, what do you think? What would you like? We haven't done that. We've gone onto this strange parallel universe of wistfully creating our ideal device and not fully communicating the harms, is how I feel.
This is all still fairly new. Do you know of any kind of evidence or research into how too much screen time as a youngster can affect you later in life?
Yes, there's lots of evidence coming up now. So as a simple rule, the earlier a child is given a smartphone, the worse their longer term outcomes are in forms of developing a behavioural addiction. And if they're developing behavioural addiction to the device, that might make them less able to self-regulate, not only around that device, but around other things. Also, if they're spending all that time on devices from a young age, then they're going to be not as good a communicators as they would have been without it. It might start impacting on all elements of their lives. So the relationship guidance that they get online is notoriously unhealthy. We've seen a huge rise in misogynistic crimes. There's 3,000 violent crimes against women and girls in this country, I think, per day. And this is increasing all the time. I mean, they're actually considering it an emergency, given the rate of the increase in violent crime towards women and girls. And that's no small part due to this extensive influence online. And that's going to profoundly impact them, because they're more exposed to abuse. They're probably going to make less healthy relationship choices, and then suddenly you've created an environment that's going to be blighting all other areas of your life, because we know how important the relationships we make are as contributors to our overall happiness.
One of the big issues with these devices is, as you've talked about, the constant access to the internet. I wanted to get your views on some of those as a healthcare professional working with young people. One of the big ones is this kind of radicalising of young males by this got extreme manosphere content. Could you talk to us a bit about that?
Yes, the manosphere. It's extraordinary, isn't it? There's a whole new dictionary of terms.
Yeah.
It's really frightening. A report I've just read talks about that it's really easy to take the wrong path. And that's from Internet Matters, I think. And it was saying, it says in this report that a quarter of boys at any age feel positive feelings and approval of influencers like Tate. And there's a huge number of young fathers who are also supporters and encouragers of the Tate influence. And that's really frightening, because you've got all his business and aspirational money-making schemes that are quietly running alongside this extremely violent, misogynist content that young boys, and unfortunately young fathers, it's showing in these reports, are watching. And what does that say about the family environment that's being cultivated there? And we know, because women and girls are reporting it all the time, that this abuse is increasing all the time. And the really sad thing is that the image-based sexual abuse, the sexting and the generating of these sexual images, most of the perpetrators are children themselves, as we've said. And I think the problem is when women and girls, well, when young women have been in these situations, I was reading a report from 5 years ago, and it was saying that over 75% of those victims of child pornography, they're never the same again. So they feel guilt, they feel shame, they feel horror that people might have thought that they actively participated in the images. There are no winners, even if people are convicted of these crimes. Once they've been committed, they really impact on that young person. And once a person has been abused, so once a young girl has been abused, her self-esteem is dramatically lowered. And then she'll go on to make poor relationship choices. There's a lot of evidence to say that girls start to misunderstand relationships with men and feel that all physical contact with men should lead to sex. They get stuck in this rabbit hole of persistent, negative, harmful sexual situations by no fault of their own, just from that first incident. And it's just so sad to think that this is so liberally happening all the time. And I think tech companies do have more power to stop it. We know Ofcom has the power to stop it. And not that it's been normalised, but I feel that we're maybe becoming a bit numb to the size of these statistics and the quantity that it's being washed over us. And at some point, we're going to have to do something bigger than what we're doing now.
Why do you think these young guys are pushed towards that kind of thing? I mean, when I was young, if I read something like that, I would be like, wow, and there's nothing to do with me. There's so many of them seem to be getting into it.
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, going back to Tate, unfortunately, it's the aspirational lifestyle, this whole filtered, sublimely successful, whatever they feel is the most manly image, is being funneled into their brains, and they're watching on short reel content. It's like it's kind of just hard wiring it into their brains. And I think they possibly are attracted to the fast cars, the girls, all the kind of images of girls looking super glamorous or a particular body shape. It's so horrifying how senseless and dehumanising the internet is of women. I was reading that 98% of deep fake content is pornographic in nature. And all the nudification software is trained onto the female body, not the male. And it's so clever. And it can clone voices, behaviours, superimpose faces, and create these whole kind of avatars and clones. And it's so real. And I feel for these young boys because it's all this horrible toxic mix, all these dreadful role models, all these images of a life that they should never really want because it doesn't bring any happiness. But we've got a lot of children from underprivileged backgrounds in this country. Unfortunately, children living in poverty is increasing all the time. They don't have lots of outdoor space. They can't be taken on great holidays or go out and play in the park. And, you know, they might have a single parent working 2 jobs, and it's just so difficult. It's so difficult to parent, it's so difficult to influence. And when you see that young fathers, presumably that we're talking about fathers over 18, you know, in their early 20s, are being bewildered and bewitched by this horrible misogynist content, it really hits home that, okay, we've got young men now that can't even see through this. You know, young men who are fathers who undoubtedly really love their children, but have somehow been completely misled by this content. So it's very powerful. It's totally intoxicating, and it's very frightening. And the article the other day about the teacher who gets misogynistic comments when she's marked homework, or vile things shouted to her when she's going back to her car. You know, this is not okay. But trying to get boys to feel more confident in a more healthy relationship, in a healthier space, means that we have to get them off these devices. We have to create space between them and that device. It gets clear their heads, give them a chance to make a judgment. We're cultivating ADHD, and there's evidence for this. Diagnoses of ADHD are going up, that excessive use of devices can create ADHD traits and functional tic disorders, and it disrupts with the electricity and the wiring of their brains. So they can't think straight for 5 minutes either. So we've got to be really quite serious about what we're cultivating and give these young boys a chance, because they are ultimately vulnerable. I mean, young men that behave like that, life is not going to be easy for them. And so they are vulnerable. It's a huge worry, and I personally don't think we can solve this problem without admitting that the online world is a huge part of this. And we're kidding ourselves if we think we can just educate and prevent our way out of it. We have to get them away from it.
It's almost like a kind of social mediaizing of our society. Everything becomes a bit like 5-second snippets that shows the most glamorous thing and nothing about what's underneath the surface.
It's horrifying, yeah. And it doesn't bring happiness. And children that are on social media, it does make me laugh when it says it helps them connect. It does not do that. Children who are on social media the most invariably are isolated and lonely. It's much better for them to be around actual peer group and people. And I think we can't create this imaginary world. I resent a little bit when people say, well, you know, they need it because they're living in a digital age. Well, we're in control of that. This age is ours. It can be as digital as the human beings decide they want it to be. And digitalising childhood is catastrophic. You know, they must be allowed to be children first. The screens are just things that should be chucked in a drawer, not going up to bed with their smartphones underneath the duvet on social media till 4 or 5 in the morning. We hear this a lot at work. And no wonder they're tired. No wonder they're stressed. And they have a lot of kind of performance in their social media. They can't just send a message. They might be on a group of 100 other children. So they're living in a world where they can't just say how they feel. They have to think about the message. They post it. Oh, I wonder what so-and-so thought about it. They go back to the message and they see who's liked it, or they've put up a snap or a picture. It's just these really kind of electrifying false reward hits. And it's living in a surreal world, an unreal world, a harmful world. So I really don't like the term, we've got to look after children in the digital world. Yes, of course we have, but we've not to just trick them into thinking that unless you can survive digitally, you're not going to survive at all. That's absolute rubbish. And they're really fast learners. They've got so much space in their life to do all the things that children should be doing and be educated about screens and devices throughout their childhood and their education. But they don't need to be given smartphones for hours in the day to know that. I mean, anyone who has teens knows how whip smart they are. You know, they are perfectly able to navigate their way around, and they'll make much more sensible decisions, have better self-regulation, better self-preservation if we give them these devices later, when they've learned how to see these traps and learn how, you know, a little bit more about who they are, rather than being influenced from others all the time in an imaginary, highly filtered, mostly fake online environment.
I wanted to ask you about young girls as well. It seems social media in particular puts a lot of pressure on them. Can you talk a bit about that?
This is what really started to worry me at work. So I do quite a lot of gynae, and what I was starting to realise is, without the girls necessarily admitting it, because they maybe hadn't made the link, but we were starting to see a lot at work, girls coming in saying, I don't like the way my vulva looks, and my nipples look odd, or becoming very intolerant of a period, or very intolerant of side effects of contraception. It's this quest for perceived perfection in female bodily function, female bodily form. So you'd examine them and say, it's perfectly normal. You know, you've got a lovely body, there's nothing wrong with you. Don't think about it. Go off and, you know, get your studies done, have fun. But the deep concern and wanting to pursue cosmetic surgery for breast augmentation, age 16. We didn't used to see things like this, and this is definitely on the rise. And there's been some interesting studies from UCL coming out about the association between restrictive eating and eating disorders, particularly in girls who've been looking at these images online, and the more they see these images of what they consider to be the perfect body or the perfect woman, the more likely they might be to develop an eating disorder or go and seek cosmetic surgery. Well, that may have been an issue for girls. I remember when we were teens, we'd look at a magazine and feel slightly bad about ourselves, but it's extreme now. You know, we wouldn't have, at 14, have most of us been wanting to pursue cosmetic surgery. We probably wouldn't have even really known what that was. But now it's so kind of prolifically available everywhere they look. I remember the Kylie Jenner lip craze. That was dreadful. They were ordering these awful injections of lip fillers, teenagers, younger than teenagers, from Amazon and places like that, and they were just sticking these things into their lips. And then we had the thigh gap craze, where they all wanted the little gap between the tops of their thighs, and they would do awful things to themselves to create that. And it's entrapment. It's not a sign of anything other than a child with really low self-esteem who just can't be happy with their own body. And that has always been difficult. Teenage years have always been difficult. But it's so much harder for them now because they just can't get away from it. And the problem is with the algorithms is they might look up one image, and then these wretched algorithms then feed them more of those images, don't they? And they don't care, the social media companies don't care that that image might have been a sweet little sausage dog, so they'll look more sausage dogs. But if they were actually looking at something much more harmful than that, like a person suffering with anorexia or contemplating self-harm, in come all those images and that content without them even asking for it. I mean, that's abuse in itself. And I think it's the extent of that I don't think as a society we're fully realising. And certainly in general practice, we'd started to realise that these children are burdened by it. So that's why I just mostly want to set them free, whilst keeping the reality they should learn, but not be exposed to the extent that they are now.
I also wanted to ask you about pornography. Obviously, phones give access to pornography. Some of it's really quite extreme. What effect is this having on young people?
Well, it's awful, because I think boys can sometimes feel under pressure that a certain level of violence is what girls want, which of course isn't, and it's abuse. There was a craze of asphyxiation. We were hearing a lot about that. Teenage girls reporting that it was just normal for boys to grab them round the neck with sexual contact. This is dreadful. I mean, it's assault. And it makes me so sad that most young men doing that probably haven't learnt that. And they've maybe been falsely educated around it being something that that other person might want. And that's back to the entrapment again, that they're learning the majority of these really malignant relationship behaviours online, and then not recognising what a healthy relationship looks like. And we know that once we've been in an unhealthy relationship, we're more likely to go into another one, because we start to not realise maybe crimes are being committed around us, and we get into that cycle of being trapped and seeking the same traits in partners that we don't realise to be harmful. So we're putting this in from the start, from their development, which gives them a really dreadful start in life. Because I think what's happening now is that they're seeing all this very precocious and unhealthy content long before they even know fully how or why we have periods. So it's kind of jumped in and taken over in a place where solid and healthy education should be. And I think that's been a real detriment to them. And I think it's very upsetting for the girls as well, because they're not able to communicate with each other what they really want out of a relationship often, because they're not being taught it, the language isn't been spoken, or they're communicating by social media too much possibly. And it's just become quite worrying, and it does have a knock-on effect to how they make relationships later on in life.
Dr. Rebecca Foljambe, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Lee. Thank you.